I'm Hadar Hazony,
And I'm Titus Techera.
and this is Transvaluation, a series of conversations dedicated to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil.
We are in the middle of chapter one. We have gotten to the major theme, perhaps physiology. In the previous sections, we talked about Nietzsche's attack on ancient science and modern science, or ancient philosophy and modern philosophy. Here he begins to explain how he thinks science could be not overthrown but radicalized. What would it mean to take the modern anti-teleological uh, way of thought and really push it forward? So let's start with aphorism 13, Hadar.
Let's do it. Aphorism 13. Physiologists should think before putting down the instinct of self-preservation as the cardinal instinct of an organic being. A living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent results. In short, here as everywhere else, let us beware of superfluous teleological principles, one of which is the instinct of self-preservation. We owe it to Spinoza's inconsistency. Thus, method, which must essentially economy of principles, which must be essentially economy of principles, demands it.
Yeah, so the importance of self-preservation is that behind what you might think of as just the modern science of nature, there is a deeper assumption. It's there everywhere you look. It's there, of course, in liberalism, which is based on self-preservation, on the first law of nature, as Thomas Hobbes says it. This much the liberal tradition keeps from the natural law tradition it overturns. And so, both in our self understanding and the politics on the one hand, and on the other hand, in our thinking through what life is, self preservation is presumed to be the purpose. And that, of course, can become a problem for Nietzsche wants to get rid of it because it clouds the issue of what is being preserved. But if you give up the teleological principle of self-preservation, the right to life, and then the right to think about life in that sense, then you also must take this other, even more radical step and to say that discharge is the wish of being. For life itself to be will to power, it means that every organism has to act out its powers to the best that it can, to the best that circumstances allow as well, of course. And therefore, there is not, you cannot have a kind of pacifism either in science and the intellect or in politics. You have to start to think about it the other way around, that everywhere around you there is conflict. You go to the forest, you should think that every tree is trying to kill every other tree. They spread their branches, they spread their roots, and they destroy everything that competes. And that's just, I guess, for an appetizer. Now, more on the theoretical side, rather than this question of attitude or what is it that you see when you look around, what Nietzsche is trying to get at is that to save science or philosophy from the catastrophe of modernity as he sees it, one has to give it its greatest possible strength, its greatest possible concentration. It has to restore to thought its true character, that is to say, do away with all of the presuppositions. Self-preservation is one such presupposition, and it could go even beyond that. Uh, as we will see, economy of principle is something that matters to him. And so this, so also the statement, life is itself is will to power. It's it suggests how you could begin to rethink all philosophy, but it doesn't give you the end. You don't know how that will turn out yet. Later on in the section, he will give an analysis of will to help put us on our path. But for now, he reiterates will to power because it is somehow above will to life. Previously, he had opposed will to truth and will to life. Now, he could say that he redefines life as will to power. And that is supposed to have a quality parallel to the economy of principle. It has to be a vision simple enough to help you think yourself through the ruin of modern thought to a thought that isn't itself ruinous.
Yeah. If life is discharge primarily, what he's doing, as you were pointing out, is cutting off the ends to which that discharge is oriented. Life is not living force. Organic beings are not designed for a purpose. What they are designed for is to exert themselves. And the question of what that exertion is for is not included in the mechanism, the organic mechanism, which allows such an exertion. That's why he says it's the teleological principle is superfluous. You don't have to assume that living beings grow in order to survive. You can just simply say they grow because they are living. To live is to grow, to get bigger, to get stronger. And obviously, the important implication of this is that often living beings will choose to die. And that's a very perplexing and strange development in the organic world. It's particularly unique to human beings, although it's probably not only true of human beings. And so then the question is, how can it be if it were really the case that the purpose of life is to survive? You know, this is kind of a Darwinian principle. The purpose of the development of the organism is to preserve its life, to prevent it from dying. Then how could it be that human beings do choose to die? And then behind that, an even deeper metaphysical question, or that's probably the wrong word, but a question of valuation. If the purpose of life is to survive, then wouldn't it be the case that anything you would do to survive would be worth it, would be worthy? And that leads you to this kind of debasement of life where, you know, any form of life is worth living as long as you don't die, you know, including betraying your friends and lying to your loved ones and becoming something low and detestable. But as long as you don't die, it's worth it. Because if the purpose of life is to survive, then if that is the highest purpose of life, if self-preservation becomes our ultimate principle, and as you were pointing out, Nietzsche is implying that in many ways, modern commercial culture is like that. We do place our self-preservation above all things if we think about our lives as a series of calculations of interest. We think about the choices we make. How do I get more money? How do I get more status? How do I acquire this good or that good, without asking what the value of our life is? Not merely to preserve it, but what should be done with it. Then in some way you are truly driving your life to become something lower. So there's this attack on self-preservation is not merely, it really is an attack on Darwinianism, but it's not merely a debate with biologists, because it has a wider implication to the question of valuations.
Yeah, and it's supposed to push thought forward as well. If you get to assume self-preservation, it's much easier to stop thinking. You'd only have to explain that sometimes self-preservation doesn't work out or somebody commits suicide, but you don't have to explain self-preservation itself in terms of something more fundamental. And Nietzsche wants to go in that direction.
How do you think the principle of the will to power explains self-preservation, right? Because self-preservation is an existing phenomenon, which Nietzsche is arguing is only an iteration of this greater principle, a more important principle, which is the will to power.
Yeah, he even says it's an indirect result of a greater principle. It's common, but it's not the fundamental thing. It is actually derivative, and I ultimately that would mean to say that organisms exert themselves in some specific way with some specific power, and self-preservation is involved in that only to the extent to which that activity unfolds. Self-preservation would only become visible, in fact, so to speak, in the lull between activity that is much more spasmodic. That that is to say that to judge organisms by their self-preservation state is to misunderstand what they actually are. You judge them more truly when you judge what they do. Their activity is their essence. And that activity, of course, will consume their lives too.
Yeah. So if at the current moment, uh, preserving your life will open up an opportunity to a greater expression of power, then it is perhaps the case that a person or an animal will choose to preserve itself. But when these two things will come into conflict, self-preservation at the cost of a higher degree of power, a higher state of being, then human beings will choose not to preserve themselves.
Yeah, and I think this is the way Nietzsche explains why organisms ever get more sophisticated. There are still monocellular organisms. You could say that's a kind of immortality of life. Why should life become more complex if it's self-preservation? You would say, well, it's not self-preservation. Life is will to power, and hence organisms become more sophisticated. They become more powerful.
Is there a mortality that's necessary for the will to power? Is this a kind of tragic reading of the organic where by necessity for a living thing to become more complex means that it will become more unstable?
Yeah, it seems inevitable that the if being is activity, it's also striving. It's also, that is to say, full of uncertainty. So there are no guarantees.
Fascinating. Aphorism 14. It is perhaps just dawning on 5 or 6 minds that physics, too, is only an interpretation and exegesis of the world, to suit us, if I may say so, and not a world explanation. But insofar as it is based on belief in the senses, it is regarded as more, and for a long time to come must be regarded as more, namely as an explanation. Eyes and fingers speak in its favor. Visual evidence and palpableness do too. This strikes an age with fundamentally plebeian tastes as fascinating, persuasive, and convincing. After all, it follows instinctively the canon of truth of eternally popular sensualism. What is clear? What is explained? Only what can be seen and felt. Every problem has to be pursued to that point. Conversely, the charm of the Platonic way of thinking, which was a noble way of thinking, consisted precisely in resistance to obvious sense evidence. Perhaps among men who enjoyed even stronger and more demanding senses than our contemporaries, but who knew how to find a higher triumph in remaining masters of their senses, and this by means of pale, cold, gray concept nets which they threw over the motley whirl of the senses, the mob of the senses, as Plato said. In this overcoming of the world, the interpreting of the world in the manner of Plato, there was an enjoyment different from that which the physicists of today offer us, and also the Darwinists and anti-teleologists among the workers in physiology, with their principle of the smallest possible force and the greatest possible stupidity. Where man cannot find anything to see or to grasp, he has no further business. That is certainly an imperative different from the Platonic one, but it may be the right imperative for a tough, industrious race of machinists and bridge builders of the future, who have nothing but rough work to do.
So, at first glance, the 14 doesn't belong in the sequence on physiology. And perhaps if he didn't mention physiology and Darwinism here, it would be hard to prove to people that this entire sequence makes perfect sense. He is driving at something. But he does mention these things. And so it's easier to say, look, why does physics count within physiology? Why does it? Well, it's primarily because to give an account of life would not be a full account if the dependence of life on non-life were not acknowledged and thought through. The air you breathe isn't alive the way you are. Somehow, being includes both life and non-life, and non-life seems the more permanent and in a way even more important part. At any rate, it is that with which life would have to struggle. And so a full account, a full science would have to speak not only about life as will to power, but to put that in the context of things that are not living beings. And the first step in that part, of course, as with Nietzsche, is to say, look first to their motives. Why are they this way? Modern science belongs to a bunch of engineers. And that kind of work requires only ugly truths. It only has to work. And therefore, it cannot allow anything else but ugly truths. The ugly truth about anything you're ever going to run into is that you can turn it into whatever you want to turn it into. You can get energy out of it. You can get something out of it that we want to get. That's not understanding being. It doesn't account for the highest power of any organism, but it is useful for whatever you want. And that's the society of which he speaks. And the fact that the science fits the society is partly an argument against the truth of the science, although that's more complicated. It's a little too neat, though. It's a little too pat that it should be just so. And so he returns for a moment to show, for contrast, ancient Platonic science was far nobler. Because it attempted to see any being as the being that it is, and to put aside you could say, the grabbiness of being human, this eternally popular sensualism. I have to be sure of some things. I'm sure of my senses. Without perception, what else do you have anyway? But of course, once you admit perception, in fact, you admit much more. You admit a kind of vulgar attack on being in not because your senses are your senses and you trust them, but because nothing else has the same character. Nothing else can be trusted quite in the way you trust your senses. And so it's very easy to come to the thought that nothing else can be trusted. The and so there is something particularly petty in modern thought because it somehow patterns itself or aims at reproducing within science something like the uh, power of conviction that we have in our senses. And of course, modern science does that or originated in an attempt to do that on purpose, to get rid of religion, to get rid of people talking about angels that you can never touch. So it people, so to speak, have forgotten. But modern science was atheistic on purpose and by design. Now, at the point at which Nietzsche gets his hands on modern science, it it uh, it only has the defects of that virtue, if it ever was a virtue. This attitude does not create new science, it does not achieve impressive understandings of being, and it doesn't serve what is greatest in man. What it does is prohibit, in a way, thought. It neither allows you to think through your experience poetically and do a scientific investigation of that on the one hand, nor on the other hand does it allow you to think through the inner demands of science, which would, if that mattered to anybody, we would all be a lot more mathematical than we actually are. Instead, what we get is engineering. And I guess it's better that it works than that it doesn't, but it's not an impressive achievement. And part of that is why he says, look at those people with their Platonism. For sure they were wrong, but on the other hand, were they not more human, and did they not get an enjoyment in their self-overcoming that people who are, in a way, so to speak, slaves in their minds can't get? It's we're building a science such as it is, even at the expense of our ability to love it. What must the consequence of that be? We are against ourselves in that sense, and hence the scientific revolution Nietzsche proposes would involve that people should be able to love science, but it would be obviously a much more dangerous kind of science.
Of course, physics is the most abstract of the sciences, of the disciplines in science. So in that sense, if you take the most noble of the modern scientific disciplines, it's more abstract than chemistry, than biology, than zoology, or any of these other alternatives. The corresponding place that you would say classical science or medieval science had was metaphysics or theology, right? Things so abstract that they cannot be seen by the senses at all, and there's no way to demonstrate them. But even physics, the most abstract of the modern sciences, is central in this way, that it is trying to explain things that are happening in the material world, which our senses can track and trace. But Nietzsche says, but it's not really an explanation. It never answers the question why. It only answers the question how. That is to say, that it can track the motions in matter and explain what those motions are. Well, I shouldn't use the word explain, but it can predict those motions, find a regularity in them. But what it does not explain is, what are these motions for? And the Platonic perspective did aspire to say what the ultimate good is. The Platonic philosopher, he is contemplating the objective eternal good, which is supposed to explain what all of the appearances are for, why they're happening. So it's an explanation. Now, wrong explanation, sure, but it is an explanation. And this is something very interesting. So Nietzsche often refers to Plato as noble. And it has something to do with this, with the overcoming of the senses, a kind of self-mastery where the Platonic philosopher says, I know that I am feeling one thing, I am seeing one thing, I am hearing one thing, but that isn't the truth. That's an appearance. And I'm going to overcome that appearance. I'm going to get beyond that appearance. So I'm going to rule my senses. And my will for truth is going to go beyond the senses, which Nietzsche respects. And we saw um, in our previous conversation how there are cases in modern science, Boscovich and Copernicus, where exactly this kind of overcoming of what seems evident in the sensory data is what allows for deeper, greater truths. On the other hand, though, when we get towards the end of the book, we will see that there's the master morality and the slave morality. And the slave morality is the one, it's not the one who rules the other person, but the one that rules the senses and posits the external world. So it's a funny relationship because here he's saying it's Platonism which rules the senses. What he doesn't say is that it's Christianity which rules the senses. But of course, he did say that in the preface. And so there's this tension between, on the one hand, the sensual as a trap, as a limitation. Our senses are preventing us from creating new modes of life, aspiring to higher truths. And on the other hand, Nietzsche also wants to be suspicious of anybody who wants to posit or claim that there is a sensible world. Because obviously the question is, well, how do you know that's true? Right? That's why moderns don't like things that are not sensible, because there's always the question of, well, how do you actually know that that's true? It could be very impressive. It could be very noble. It can be aspire to a great world explanation and all these things. But how do you know it's actually true? And Nietzsche, especially this aphorism and the next one we're going to read, he's playing both sides of this game. He doesn't like the notion that we would limit ourselves only to conclusions that are readily apparent in the sensory data. He thinks that that would be dehumanizing, and that would be a kind of degenerative form of human thought, and would make us more like animals. But at the same time, he doesn't like people who soar around on these extremely abstract notions, which cannot be proven in any way, and they turn out to be just an escape from a person's actual life, right? They become an excuse to believe whatever you want. And that's why in Zarathustra, of course, he says you need both the eagle and the snake, right? You need both to soar, to have this expansive explanation of the world, but then you need the rough work of physics. You need the actual demonstration of how, in the empirical material reality, our senses actually trace these developments. And he never chooses a side. It's always, I'm on this side, but I'm on this side. You look at it from this perspective, but you have to remember that that's a problem. I think that the insertion of this aphorism here is to restrain would-be physiologists who want to reduce everything to the body and the senses, which Nietzsche does want to do. He does want to explain everything through the body and the senses. He wants to limit them and say, yes, but we are not merely our bodies. We are not merely our senses.
Yeah, there's an inherent difficulty because he wants, on the one hand, to say the first standard for judgment will be using his life. But he also says we also have to look at the inner structure of life, which turns out to include this incredible complexity that develops more sophistication, develops ultimately the ambition to give an account of the world. The nobility of the Platonic philosopher consists in attempting, in putting man above his circumstances, to place man in the cosmos, in the greatest possible context, taking responsibility for the greatest possible view of being. And clearly modern science does not have that ambition. And Nietzsche seems to somehow want to restore on the basis of modern science, anti-teleological science, the ambition to take a hold of the cosmos in the mind. And so that involves taking this terrible risk, however, that you have to say physics doesn't explain things, it only interprets it. It's an interpretation that fits this society. It's an interpretation that fits this way of life. It's not the explanation. And that it's the great danger of cutting off any such thing as knowledge from our reach. But he seems to think it's necessary because otherwise, indeed, modern science would be too reductive. It would, it's an obvious thing about modern scientists. They can't say why they even exist. If they're not even aware that that's a problem, then clearly something in their education and something in their souls is wrong. And Nietzsche would like a science that can give an account of itself, and of course that would give a noble account of itself too, such that it could plausibly claim to rule over mankind.
Aphorism 15. To study physiology with a clear conscience, one must insist that the sense organs are not phenomena in the sense of idealistic philosophy. As such, they could not be causes. Sensualism, therefore, at least as a regulative hypothesis, if not a heuristic principle. What? And others even say that the external world is the work of our organs? But then our body, as part of this external world, would be the work of our organs. But then our organs themselves would be the work of our organs. It seems to me that this is a complete reductio ad absurdum, assuming that the concept of a causa sui is something fundamentally absurd. Consequently, the external world is not the work of our organs?
And here you can see how 15 follows from the previous ones. If we wish to speak without any of the theological presuppositions, if we wish to get rid of religion, then we would have to give a true scientific account. Now that would have to be an account of our connection to the world, and there the great refuge of modern philosophy against theology was subjectivism. If you retreat into the inner workings of thought of the mind, as with the Cartesian dubito and as with Kantian transcendental analysis, you are in a position to establish the inner workings of thought as thought, of the mind as mind, and therefore have finally found safe ground. This is something that religion cannot touch. And if you've got this much, then you can build out all the incredible edifices of modern philosophy. That's the dream. That's the attempt. But you do run into this problem. What is real? What is the world? And what is your grasp on it? It's your body, it's your organs. Are they real? Following down the path of modern philosophy, as we can always see in the behavior of scientists, is somehow pretending that you don't exist, that you have some kind of grasp of the universe that does not involve your body. It's somehow very easy for people to think that if they're just doing machine readings, if they're just reading things on a dial, then the weakness of the eyes or of man's body is no longer a problem because the machines have saved us. That's just child's play. It's a kind of foolishness that one expects in children and is perhaps a little surprised to find in adults, but it is merely a correlative of a much worse theoretical problem of establishing what is our grasp of the real and of the beings. And that cannot simply be left at saying that, well, it's phenomena. Because awareness, some form of cognition, is not enough to speak properly of a being. You would also have to think of cause. Some senses are obviously causal. For example, touch. Everything you touch, you cause to be otherwise than it is, so to speak. And you would not be able to come to know it by touch in any neutral way, in any non-causal way. So somehow you have to accept that the body is part of the world. You are your body. In fact, if people could stop talking about their bodies in third person, we would be a lot farther, a lot faster. But clearly, that's incredibly hard for people to do for moral reasons, strangely enough. But from Nietzsche's point of view, then this means you do not get to talk science with a clear conscience. You clearly have these limits, this shyness, if you will, about facing up to these cognitive and causal demands of sense, of your being who you are in the world in which you are that. And that means obviously there's always going to be very severe limits on all scientific achievement. There's always going to be severe limits on all higher thought. But that's the ground on which you can build any thought whatsoever, any science whatsoever. You cannot put yourself in a situation where you say, first of all, let's assume we don't exist, and then let's study the world as it is, irrespective of the way in which we corrupt this pure world of objectivity. And of course, you could not go down the other path either and say, actually, we have to assume that we have an almost creative power over the universe because it appears to us, and that's all in our power. The senses are somehow causal, somehow cognitive, and figuring out the differences between the eye and the hand is very important.
Yeah, I love this aphorism because it's so short and it references probably the most important philosophical scientific debate of the modern era, right? The empiricist rationalist debate. And then so it references this whole debate. If you're not aware of it, then you'll just miss it. But Nietzsche doesn't explain it to you. He just assumes that you've read a book. And then it dances all around this debate, laughing the entire time. It takes the most important philosophical debate of the modern era, and it seems to not take it seriously at all, right? So as you said, the original, perhaps you could call it idealist position of Kant and Descartes, that the organs and their senses are mere phenomena. They cannot be the explanatory principle. We can't verify reality through them. And retreating into some kind of pure rationalism. Well, that we've already established is unverifiable, right? And in a sense, opposed to life. But the other position, the physiological position, also is untenable. And this is such a funny little movement of the mind where he says, if really it is the case that what is real is what the body is sensing, everything that's external in the world, it's not our mind, it's not that we can know anything about it through rationalism, it's through our senses that we know it's real. But how do we know that we have bodies? Well, because we can touch them and feel them and smell them. That's how we know that we have bodies. So the bodies are real because the body can feel them. And that's obviously a logical paradox, unless you want to say that the body doesn't exist anywhere other than in itself. The body is the truth in itself, right? Which is also, it's a ludicrous position to take, that the body is this self-creating God. So then you come back to the previous position of saying, well, no, then the body must exist somewhere else, not in itself, but in something else. And now you've returned to rationalism. And it's an infinite loop, right? That these two modes of thought push to and feed into each other. And neither of them is on its own sufficient, I think, as you were saying, to ground an ultimate explanation of reality. You can't explain life ultimately through this kind of puritanical philosophizing in one of these schools. And Nietzsche doesn't ever really choose a side, right? He sees the virtues and vices of each um, philosophical mode, and he uses both of them at different times, even though they are, in a sense, contradictory.
Yeah, it seems like modern schools of philosophy make demands that you know that lead them to self-destruction. You could end up with empiricists studying the experience of which they believe will be the source of knowledge up until they decide that in fact you can't experience causation, and so there's no cause as such. How you get and so it seems like all of these schools of thought are going to collapse, and the science built on them cannot advance much farther. And it seems, since scientists are basically running around playing with what philosophers do, they're a lagging indicator. Nietzsche looks at the philosophers, they are the leading indicator. Philosophy was collapsing all around him in the 19th century. Thinking through what knowledge is and thinking through what cause is, being and your access to being, all of this stuff was falling apart. And you could still build science on that philosophy for a while, and then it turned out not to be possible anymore. And we're in the situation we are now, where it's embarrassing how little we have to brag about in our quest for progress. And he seems to think, however, that there may be a way out of this. This is very tentative. It's even for him unusual to end with that dash that suggests this is all a thought in passing, but also suggests an interruption. But it's again not merely a caution to about the limits of modern prejudices in thought. He insists that you should start from the body. That's somehow more sound, but you should not assume the empiricism. Rationalism is slightly less diluted. There's something about thinking through the inner workings of the mind that is indispensable. But it seems that it's applied from the wrong premises in the wrong way. And so it seems like he's actually repurposing modern philosophy as he was repurposing modern science previously. These things could be put to use for somebody who is not demented about the basics of existence.
Aphorism 16. There are still harmless self-observers who believe that there are immediate certainties. For example, I think, or as the superstition of Schopenhauer put it, I will, as though knowledge here got hold of its object purely and nakedly as the thing in itself, without any falsification on the part of either the subject or the object. But that immediate certainty, as well as absolute knowledge and the thing in itself, involve a contradictio in adjecto. I shall repeat 100 times. We really ought to free ourselves from the seduction of words. Let the people suppose that knowledge means knowing things entirely. The philosopher must say to himself, when I analyze the process that is expressed in the sentence I think, I find a whole series of daring assertions that would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to prove. For example, that it is I who think, that there must necessarily be something that thinks, that thinking is an activity and operation on the part of a being who is thought of as a cause, that there is an ego, and finally, that it is already determined what is to be designated by thinking, that I know what thinking is. For if I had not already decided within myself what it is, by what standard could I determine whether that which is just happening is not perhaps willing or feeling? In short, the assertion I think assumes that I compare my state at the present moment with other states of myself, which I know, in order to determine what it is. On account of this retrospective connection with further knowledge, it has, at any rate, no immediate certainty for me. In place of the immediate certainty in which the people may believe in the case at hand, the philosopher thus finds a series of metaphysical questions presented to him, truly searching questions of the intellect. To wit, from where do I get the concept of thinking? Why do I believe in cause and effect? What gives me the right to speak of an ego, and even of an ego as cause, and finally, of an ego as the cause of thought? Whoever ventures to answer these metaphysical questions at once by an appeal to a sort of intuitive perception, like the person who says, I think and know that is, at least, is true, actual, and certain, will encounter a smile and two question marks from a philosopher nowadays. Sir, the philosopher will perhaps give him to understand. It is improbable that you are not mistaken, but why insist on the truth?
The one of the oddities of modern philosophy is that it not only insisted on its own progressive character, but also on its popularity. Everybody is going to get enlightened. It's not just that enlightenment is a progressive process. With Nietzsche, this is abandoned. What's humorous is that it's what constitutes knowledge that he throws to the people. Enlightenment has been reduced to propaganda, and and what he says in this aphorism you can take as a kind of program for what later thinkers all were trying to do. Famously, Heidegger, I could say that each one of these things is a bunch of essays or parts of being and time that Heidegger is trying to answer. But also people who had nothing to do with Nietzsche, like Husserl, trying to explain what thinking even is, what are the conditions of consciousness that are involved in natural perception, or on the other hand, in scientific thought and so forth. And so with everybody else. And so a lot of the power of Nietzsche's thought has to do with showing what everybody was going through and almost nobody was willing to admit. The incredible ambitions of modern philosophy and the incredible popularity of modern philosophy led people to assume much more than they knew, and led to failures that were in a way too public for philosophy to survive. And some of the new enterprise of Nietzsche is to free philosophy from that kind of ambition and from that kind of, if you will, shame. It doesn't matter what system any systematic philosopher came up with. What matters is thinking through the basics of human experience, returning philosophy to its origins, not trying to add to the great modern edifice, or not trying to revolutionize it by an even more impressive modern edifice, but returning to these fundamentals of being human. The oddity that we are questionable, and in certain ways we seem only to be what we are because we raise questions. A practical way of putting that, to begin to get at what he's saying here, is think about whatever it is that think about love. Mostly it doesn't work out. People are for sure that it's very important, and that must somehow imply that they know, or they believe they know what love is. And yet that must somehow fly in the face of constant heartbreak, depression, crime, etc. But that is also true of justice. We feel strongly about it. We must believe in some sense that we know what it is and even how to get it, because we have to act. And yet we are all about justice on the basis of the awareness that we can almost never get it to work. Uh, if you think through these things, you see how much better it might be to recur to basic human experience when you want to begin philosophy. Now the step Nietzsche takes is to apply this kind of awareness to the edifice of modern science and modern philosophy. These people cannot open their mouths for 15 seconds without making more assumptions than they could justify in a lifetime. And so long as philosophy is reduced to clarifying in what way Kant was right, or something like that, it's not possible either for philosophy to be philosophy or for mankind to prosper in this sense. It's going to lead to a catastrophe, or rather, it's going to just deepen the catastrophe it has already led to. And contrary-wise, Nietzsche here begins to show you the depth of philosophical investigation, not simply criticizing people or opinions, but showing you what it would mean to think through what you're saying. Once you start thinking of the I and of thought as activity and therefore a cause of thought, how much pressure do we put on that I? How much of a burden? And in that sense, this aphorism explains the crisis of modern philosophy from the previous aphorism, which you very well brought out. But it also begins to suggest that there is a way out, and it has to do with the philosophical attitude and with the power of mind typical of philosophy. The attitude is a certain kind of skepticism amused of what people believe they know. But the power of mind has to do with looking at the inner structures of things. It is useful that people are also wrong, because somebody like Nietzsche can come along and show you every strange assumption built in there and make you ask, how many of these things do you think go together? How many of these things do you think you could prove? Where would you like to place your bets? You could think through even the crisis of modernity. You could think through the failure of modern philosophy. It's it's in that sense, its failure is a step toward success for Nietzsche. He's not giving this up or throwing his hands in the air. He's for sure that if you look at it carefully, you begin to understand what is it that makes these people fail, but also in a way, what it is that they're grasping at. How could you articulate the being human as a knowing being more carefully?
Yeah, the words I think, they serve a dual purpose here. On the one hand, it's a reference to Descartes and to the entire project of German idealism, this attempt to ground reality in something that's objective in our thoughts. And the entirety of Hegel's phenomenology is a movement to try to track the entire process of thinking to demonstrate the reality is real. And on the other hand, I think is merely the beginning of a sentence which every philosopher has ever used to explain their understanding of reality. So it's both a particular reference to a moment in history, but it's also a universal reference to philosophy in general. The conditions under which philosophy is possible. What are the conditions under which philosophy is possible? Well, one, that you must assume that there is such a thing as knowledge. And two, you must assume that you would know that something is knowledge if you saw it. You assume that there is a truth. You assume that you know the difference between truth and falsehood, or if you don't know it currently, that you could somehow attain the ability to distinguish between truth and falsehood. You have to assume that you are choosing to do this and not something else. That this kind of activity, this philosophizing, is different from just poetry or saying what you feel or or just instinctive physical motion. These are conditions under which are necessary for there to exist philosophy. In this sense, this aphorism is in a certain way a parody or a mimicking of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But the difference is that Nietzsche doesn't think that he's proven that these conditions are objectively true or that they really exist. He is simply saying, in order for our words and our thoughts to make any sense, we'd have to assume that these are correct. And so then he ends with this sentence, as you rightly pointed out, which is a humorous sentence. That if somebody says, I think, then the response to them is, sir, it is improbable that you are not mistaken. But why insist on the truth? And he doesn't put this statement in his own mouth, right? He puts it in the mouth of this supposed philosopher. And even then, he hides what the supposed philosopher is saying in a triple negative. It is improbable that you are not mistaken. So there is something, at least, I don't know if it's dangerous or questionable or reckless about this conclusion at the end of the aphorism. But the conclusion is, it's unlikely that philosophy actually is true. It's unlikely. Does that mean that philosophy isn't true? No, he didn't say that. Because if you really believe that it wasn't true at all, then obviously the obvious question is, well, why engage in philosophy? So he says it's unlikely. And then he adds to that, but why insist on the truth? Isn't it the case that having the search for truth, if the search for truth requires certain fundamental errors, well, wouldn't it be worth having those fundamental errors so that we could continue searching for the truth?
Yeah, so, philosophy as established by modern philosophers certainly is something else than the philosopher as Nietzsche presents him. And here he operates that separation. People will have to still pretend to be enlightened. Philosophers no longer have to pretend to be enlightened. It is, in fact, you could say that as with the beginning of the chapter and the preface, the revolution of Nietzsche is restoring to people their ignorance. Shocking as it is, it's better for you to be aware of uncertainty and beyond that of ignorance. It's better than to assume you know what knowledge is, that i.e. that you're a scientist and that you are somehow also a scientific apparatus in operation. How you deal with the ignorance of the people who think they know, you might do it with a smile, as he says here. But the new situation, the philosopher of nowadays, is one of facing up to ignorance, is one of asking again, what is knowledge? What is it to know? Who are we that we are so? By what powers am I doing this? And you could say he's leaving enlightenment to the people and taking back ignorance for the philosopher to wonder at.
Aphorism 17. With regard to the superstitions of logicians, I shall never tire of emphasizing a small terse fact, which these superstitious minds hate to concede, namely, that a thought comes when it wishes, and not when I wish, so that it is a falsification of the facts of the case to say that the subject I is the condition of the predicate think. It thinks, but that this it is precisely the famous old ego is, to put it mildly, only a supposition, an assertion, and assuredly not an immediate certainty. After all, one has even gone too far with this it thinks. Even the it contains an interpretation of the process and does not belong to the process itself. One infers here, according to the grammatical habit, Thinking is an activity. Every activity requires an agent. Consequently, it was pretty much according to the same schema that the older atomism sought, besides the operating power, that lump of matter in which it resides and out of which it operates, the atom. More rigorous minds, however, learn at last to get along without this earth residuum. And perhaps someday we shall accustom ourselves, including the logicians, to get along without that little it, which is all that is left of that honest little old ego.
Again, Nietzsche starts from a fundamental experience that has somehow become, so to speak, unthinkable, which is that I'm a smart guy. I'm so smart, I'm sitting here talking about Nietzsche. But my experience actually is that sometimes I read Nietzsche and nothing really makes sense to me. And other times something dawns on me. And it's not really up to me. The and that's so with anything you're thinking about, even if in many other cases you're not as focused, you're not as aware of what you're doing or comparing this state to previous states. But whenever you're trying to make sense of the world or get anything done, you will see that it's not entirely up to you. Sometimes thoughts come to you and sometimes they don't. In a way, the cleverer you are, the more you realize that you're not exactly in control of your own intellect. If you start thinking about that sort of experience, you might start going down the path Nietzsche takes and says, leave aside the delusions that we get from grammar, leave aside the superstitions of the logicians. You're not able, the smartest guy in the world, whatever people think is the smartest man in the world, nobody can put that guy on a stage and have him prove how thoughtful he is and how much in control of his own thinking. Just produce thoughts, produce insights, produce genius, whatever it is that you think you can ask of people, whatever you believe you would have to ask of people just so you can go on with your assumptions about life. It doesn't work that way. The and so somehow it's again necessary to force people into this new kind of skepticism about precisely those things that we think we are in control of. We run our entire society on doing crazy things to children in the hope of making them super smart, as though we knew what intelligence really is, how it works. Once you start questioning these things, you have dynamited the whole edifice of enlightenment. But on the other hand, if you don't ask yourself, why is it that the smartest people aren't able to control their own intellect? If anybody should do it, they could do it. Why can't the greatest scientists produce some new science? You should be able to just figure out who these smartest scientists are. That's why we have this goddamn institutional apparatus hanging over our lives and just force them to give us more science. Or maybe it's what they want to do anyway, and we'll get more science out of them because they're in such control of their own intellect. It doesn't work this way, however. It's maybe shattering somehow. You have to prove how smart you are. You realize, oh my God, I can't prove it. Oof, what now? This was my whole life. This was who I was. Maybe it's shattering. I'm not sure, but it's very real. And that's the oddity of Nietzsche's advance, especially obvious here in the first chapter. He has the ability to recur to undeniable experiences. He doesn't just criticize how people are mistaken. He points out where you would begin if you wanted not to be mistaken. Maybe you can only see that you are not an agent acting out intellection, that you are a mind causing itself to achieve all of these intellectual things. Maybe you can only realize that after you've been shaken up, but by experience or by Nietzsche or by something. But once you are in a position to notice these things, it's inescapable. The that might even mean that all of these things, if you think through, what experiences can Nietzsche appeal to in this aphorism? What does it really mean to be human? Those experiences might be enough to begin philosophizing on. And so I just want to point out that on the one hand, he's trying to turn the ruins of other philosophies into something useful by way of criticism. If you see in what way these people were wrong, if you see why they were so sure or they were so needy about what they were doing, then you begin to see something deeper in being human. They were wrong, but not entirely wrong. Within the framework of will to power, you can think about what they were trying to achieve and why we are even such beings in the first place that we behave this way. But on the other hand, there are these other things that he points out. Not just strip away the delusions of clever people, but ask yourself what cleverness is about in the first place. Why aren't you able to control thought, to start thinking, to just say to yourself, like, in 5 minutes I start thinking and I'm going to produce super thoughts. Or every morning I'll start thinking at 8:05 a.m. and just produce super thoughts for like 60 minutes at least. In fact, why doesn't the thinking go on forever if intellect is what people think it is? You should just be able to, of course, turn it on, but maybe it should be more realistic than to say it should never turn off. You're just intellecting up until you drop and then you rise again and do it again or something like that. It's it's caricatural, but these are simply things implied in what enlightened people think intellect is. This is implied everywhere in our system of education. It's implied everywhere in our media, in our scientific debates, in all of this stuff. Once you see that it's nuts, however, you have to find something to which to recur that is more serious, that offers you the ability to reflect on being human. And so I insist now and then that there are experiences you could recur to that help make sense of what Nietzsche is saying, that I don't see how anybody could get rid of this stuff. I don't think you can fix this part of being human. You're not really in control of your intellect. It doesn't mean the intellect isn't real. It just means it doesn't exactly belong to your wishes or to your imagination, whatever it is you think you are, that is to say.
Yeah, I was teaching this to a class of undergraduates recently, and I asked if anybody was a musician, and one of the students said she was. And so I asked her, "Do you ever improvise, write songs?" She said yes. And so I asked her, when you are writing a song or improvising a piece of music, are you free? Are you choosing? And she said yes and no. And I asked her to explain that. And I play music myself, and I found her answer to be very similar to my own experience. That on the one hand, there are certain patterns which you are familiar with in the past, and you insert based upon them, and you say, well, I could go this way, I can go that way. And perhaps you try one first, then try the other one second. But on the other hand, in the heat of the moment of an improvisation, it just comes. It just comes on its own. And sometimes the thing that comes is a thing that has come many times before. You play a lick, you play a pattern, you have a thought or an emotion which you're accustomed to. And sometimes it comes from nowhere. And that feeling of improvisational music, I think that this really captures what Nietzsche is getting at here, because many of the thoughts are thoughts that we've had before. And you could say, okay, well, I've had this thought before and I'm returning to it. But where does the thought come from that you have never had before? Did it come from you? But if it wasn't inside of you, how did you bring it forth? And if it was inside of you, you must have had it before. The degree to which a person who spends his time trying to come up with thoughts, like the artist who tries to come up with art and the musician who tries to come up with new music, sometimes it really is desolate and you feel like it's not coming. You're like in this desert and you're digging and digging. There's no water, it just doesn't come. And a person who experiences that, as you very well put it, if he has any self-awareness, is not going to believe that he has complete control or is the complete author of the thing, whether it is the music or the thought. It's a humbling experience, and it leads you to ask these questions. Questions like, what is the relationship between the I and the thinking? Is the thinking just a thing that simply occurs? It's like the weather, right? You don't walk outside in the morning and say, I rain today. No, you say, it is raining. But there is no it that is raining. It's just raining, right? There's a doubling of objects here where you imply that it is raining again. It's just a weakness of language. There is rain would be probably a more correct grammatical way to put this. So, would we start saying simply, there is thought? Thought has occurred. Or just with the name the object, right? Thinking. And just simply remove the I completely. Of course, this is going to be important as we move into the following sections next week, because this really sets up for an even larger question mark of free will. This sensation of thought, if we are not in control of it, and it is more likely a thing that happens to us than a thing that we cause to happen, or at the very least, it's some kind of interaction of forces, some of which are internal and others of which are external. How much of our being aware of thinking influences it at all? Is this a choice that we are making to think? Are we being compelled to think by something else that's external to us? Is thinking simply us? And, that I think essentially would finally be Hegel's position, which is we are thinking. It's not that we choose to think or choose not to think, but simply thinking is what we are. But even that would seem to remove a certain degree of freedom or a certain degree of volition, or that is to say, of willing in this whole process of thinking. And if that's the case for thinking, is that the case for other things as well? To what degree are we responsible and actually in control of everything that's happening, that we are doing, I should say? Open question.
Yeah, right. Thinking is the distinctively human power. You don't have experience of any other animals who think, but also within human experience, it somehow is more connected with freedom than anything else because it is least connected with circumstances. And so you can see why it's you'd always be saying I'm thinking, but but one guesses that primarily we don't mean it when we say it. It's more like cover for something else. But somewhere, at some point, somebody must be thinking. Somehow, thinking must occur. That is the thing of which we are aware and which we are learning to doubt. But once you see that, you could say that that's what makes us human. It's the fact that in thinking we are not exactly in control of ourselves. To some extent, thinking happens precisely because it's not me thinking. It's not my doing it. Um, to become aware that things you remember, you're not exactly in control. You can't exactly explain why did you remember that then? That's what it means to be human. There's surely a lot of thinking through it and dealing with it, but there is no prior schema that can replace these experiences, explain them away, or fix the problem. It's in some sense is going to keep causing crisis in our enlightenment world whenever people realize this at whatever level some bad stuff happens. It's inherently dangerous to ever stop the dangerous things we're doing. But it's also inevitable. It keeps happening. People are aware of it. The various designs people come up with, artistic inspiration, vitalism, social justice, like whatever it is that they come up with, all of it comes out of this, an awareness that we are not in control. There's something in the Enlightenment design of being human through education and all the reading everybody seems to be doing all the time,
Supposedly.
that's screwing with our ability to even be aware of what's going on in us and in some sense to us. In a certain way, we have obviously been robbed of our passive receptivity. Just to be aware of what the hell is going on, noticing is very difficult. And this is part of the ground of philosophy that Nietzsche is trying to recover. And I point out these experiences, and I think your example as a teacher is also very good precisely for that reason. Um, there is no way to look at a machine doing something and think this is what is happening when you're doing it or when it's happening to you. It's necessary to become aware that in certain ways you're not in control. It's funny that the philosopher of will, Nietzsche, should be the guy who thinks most about these experiences of passive receptivity, the one who most denies agency, as people say. And it somehow seems politically responsible. We should be as responsible as possible. We should be what, in the vulgar language of the times, they call agentic or high agency, or any of these ridiculous jargon phrases that are supposed to hide the terrible fears people live with. But it is true, dangerous as it is true that it's become difficult and necessary to recover basic awareness of what it means to be human, what we go through, and what it is that we are trying to think through. Philosophy is not a recipe for getting yourself a more powerful brain that will achieve more powerful achievements. Uh, philosophy might not be much more than awareness of what it means to be human and what it is that human beings do. Uh, Probably that's a better starting point than the ambitions people have from modern science, from modern philosophy, to come up with an entire system, institutionalize all of the findings, and then start torturing children with it, and everything is going to be great on that basis. This is not working, okay? Just and some part of that is a fundamental problem. Some problems you just have to deal with in practical ways, but you also need an awareness that we really are in fundamental trouble, that you really do have to recur to these experiences and think through to the best of your ability what it even means to think. Let's try and end our session, however, on a higher note and go through aphorism 18 as well.
It is certainly not the least charm of a theory that it is that it is refutable. It is precisely thereby that it attracts subtler minds. It seems that the 100 times refuted theory of free will owes its persistence to this charm alone. Again and again, someone comes along who feels he is strong enough to refute it.
So it's an unusually funny aphorism. And of course, it again makes you think of women. Um, what used to be called playing hard to get, uh, or being provocative. Uh, you know, it works. It works. And of course, applying that to a theory also lend this suggestion that maybe people do these things on purpose. It's a basis of pedagogy that you ask ironic questions. As a professor, you should know what it is that you're asking your students to learn, and of course, you should also know that they don't know it, and that you have to think about what it means to know this and what it means not to know it, but maybe to want to know it or come to want to know it or be provoked into wanting to know it. Something must change from that state of not knowing to a state of possibly knowing or inquiring into. Um, Enticement of some kind is necessary, is what I'm saying. That's a that's true of theories also. Uh, it's mm, uh, the basic part of the joke is that you're not trying to prove or disprove a theory. You're trying to prove yourself. It's believing that you're the man for the job. You will take this castle. You will conquer. And that's a more realistic and maybe we could say more moral way of thinking about theory than what is nowadays admitted. Something about the way people think about knowledge has led them to dislike intensely disagreement. But Nietzsche recovers this more natural attitude that you want to disprove what people hold dear. You want to prove yourself in this way. You want to be cleverer than the other guy. It's almost impossible for young people to be intelligent and not be show-offs. This might not even be bad. It's I guess, somehow troublesome or noisy. Not everybody's nice, calm, or with the program, but that's a necessary part of realizing that you're thinking that this is who you are, that you cannot be otherwise. And of course, there's another part of what he means, that the you can't have free will as a theory. So in a certain sense, it's self-refuting. If it's a free will, it can't be theorized. If it's a theory of free will, it's a contradiction in itself, since a theory is about that which is necessarily true. And that's some difficulty in thought itself. You, the It might not, freedom might be that experience of trying to refute free will.
Hmm.
That's also a funny thought. This is who you are. There is and there may be more to what he has on his mind when he says, think about the subtler minds. What is it that attracts them? The refutation is one thing, but the refutable too, maybe. Um, Playing with that thought that uh, others would dismiss. That's what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, I think just in the simplest sense, we have this assumption that something becomes very fundamental. Everybody agrees on it. It's unimaginable to do without it if it's rock solid. Maybe some things, but there are things that their precise use is to serve as a boundary which some people will cross. Now, not necessarily everybody can cross. Maybe that's precisely the issue. That the boundary exists because only some people can cross it. And that actually serves for people to preserve that boundary, that concept, that rule, that thought, because it remains as a tool of differentiation between people who are capable and people who are not capable. Does that make it true? No, it just means it's useful.
Everybody needs something to cut their teeth on, but of course, not everybody has the same teeth. So
Just
yeah,
think of it in the
obviously you're right. There's got to be certain kinds of separations involved in this, and the and it's inevitable that measuring oneself up against a problem also means measuring oneself up against other people who have faced it or who refuse to face it. The uh, but of course, in a sense, the humor depends on, if you will, the difference between an adult and a youngster. Youngsters can't help themselves but try. You might grow up to realize that it's just how young people are. It's just a necessary part of growing up. You couldn't hold it against them that they behave this way, and it might even be interesting to see. But one would not have to further concede to them that they have a firm grasp of what's at stake. Now, we will try to say the specifics of this particular doubt in our next discussion, when we will cover physiology and psychology and conclude chapter 1, and get to some thoughts about Nietzsche's project as outlined one step at a time here, one criticism at a time that allows him to build out an alternative, and therefore to say something about in what way could will be the unity of being.
till next time, my friend.
All the best, Hadar. Looking forward to having a complete series for one chapter, and doing, of course, the next chapter in our next series. Take care.